The other day I was reading my Bible and I came across this passage in Matthew 27 and it shook me to my core, so I went and read it again. Now I'm going to ask y'all a question. Has the Easter story always had zombies? Because that's what I'm looking at, and it's not in Revelation, it's not some medieval legend, it's right there in Matthew, in the crucifixion account. In just 2 verses, we find open graves and the dead walking around downtown Jerusalem and nobody's talking about it. Now I know they're not actually zombies, but let's read what Matthew actually wrote. Matthew 27, starting at verse 51, "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many." That's in your Bible, and I had to read it twice too. 5 events in 1 sentence. The Greek conjunction here is kai, and it means and Matthew stacks it like a dumbbell. The veil tore, and the earth shook, and the rocks split, and the tombs opened, and the saints were raised. Matthew's just reporting this like it belongs in the story. No apology, no explanation, no footnote. He just follows the report and moves on to the centurion. And I believe this is one of the most ignored passages in the Gospels. We skip it in our sermons, commentaries, rush right past it. And I believe there's a reason. Because if this really happened, it changes what the cross was doing in real time. And if it didn't happen, then we've got a bigger problem. Because the earthquakes in the same sentence, the torn veils in the same sentence, and everybody believes those. So maybe the question we need to ask is, did Matthew think this really happened? That question has been known to start a few fights. And it's true that in the ancient world, writers would use dramatic signs and imagery when an important person passed away. They were saying this death mattered. Matthew may be doing that right here, not giving the literal history in every in every point. He's using dramatic imagery to show the weight of the cross. And this is why people push back so hard. Because if this is a metaphor, where do you draw the line? The veils in the same sentence, the earthquakes in the same sentence, the rock splitting are in the same sentence. If the raised saints are just a literary device, then why not say the same about the rest? A New Testament scholar from Southeastern Baptist named Charles Kors went back and forth with the Greek text. Verses 51 through 53 are a continuous sentence in the Greek. They're connected by that word, kai. And the rock split, and the tombs opened, and the saints were raised. Every clause is grammatically parallel. It's really hard to shift from literal history to apocalyptic poetry and back to literal history inside one grammatical construction. The Greek narrative doesn't work that way. If the earthquake was real and the torn veil was real and the centurion's confession in verse 54 was real, we don't get to carve out the raised saints as the one symbolic clause. And then there's this phrase that just won't go away. They appeared to many. That's eyewitness language. That's public language. That is seen language. You don't end an apocalyptic poem with a verification clause. Now, are there still questions? Yes, of course. Who were these saints? How many of them were they? What happened to them next? Why is Matthew the only gospel writer that mentions them? Did they shoot a music video? Those are real questions, but unanswered questions aren't the same as evidence. And let's consider Matthew's audience. He's not writing in a vacuum. His audience is Jewish. They know the prophets, they know the promises. And when Matthew says that the tombs opened as the holy ones were raised, their minds didn't go to the walking dead. They go to Ezekiel 37. Look at verse 12. "I will open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people." They will go to Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake." They will go to Isaiah 26, verse 19. "The dead shall live, their bodies shall rise." What Matthew's saying is that this language of resurrection hope is not a new thing. It was here before the cross. This isn't a decoration, it's an answer. An answer to the prophets, an answer to Israel's hope, an answer breaking into history in a city full of people who knew the promise. And it gets sharper. In first century Judaism, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection, but the Sadducees denied it. Acts 23, 6 through 8 make that quite plain. In a city where resurrection was debated, denied by some, pushed to the future by others, God cracks open some tombs and sends the dead walking right through the streets. That looks to me like God's answering the question himself. And let me give you one more thing that's so easy to miss. It's hiding 4 chapters earlier. In Matthew 23, there are 7 woes. It's Jesus' longest confrontation with the religious leaders. And in the middle of it, he says this, "You build tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous." That's in Matthew 23, 29. Do you hear the irony here? In chapter 23, they decorate tombs. In chapter 27, God opens them. They honor dead saints with stone and inscription. They keep the prophets safely dead. and they keep their language safely under control. But they're about to kill the one to whom the prophets were pointing to. So when the tombs open in Matthew 27, this isn't just a miracle, it's an indictment. The same city that had polished the graves of the righteous is now being confronted by the righteous dead walking its very streets. The dead they honored from a safe distance are now public witness that the man they crucified has more authority over those tombs than every priest in Jerusalem. Matthew set that line right there in chapter 23, and then again in chapter 27, he closes the door. Jerusalem is the stage, Jerusalem is the audience, Jerusalem is the target. And here's the chronological problem that can tie us up if we're not careful. Matthew says that the tombs cracked open at the moment of Jesus' death. That's Friday afternoon. Verse 53 adds, coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city. What happened between Friday and Sunday? The answer is tied to the first fruits. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:20 that Christ is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. That means Jesus is not one resurrection among many. He's the first. He's the first sheaf, the beginning of the harvest. So Matthew's very careful here. The power of the cross breaks the grave on Friday, but the saints don't step foot into the city until after Christ rises. Why? Because he's the first fruits. I want you to think about this like D-Day. The beaches were taken on June the 6th, but the prisoners in the camps weren't liberated for months. The decisive blow landed right there on those beaches of Normandy, but the liberation unfolded afterwards. It was the same war, the same victory. Friday breaks the lock, Sunday opens the door, and the saints walk into Jerusalem as the first freed prisoners of war. So Good Friday's not a quiet waiting room for Easter. The veil tears, the earth shakes, the bedrock cracks, the tombs open. The cross is already striking death before the stone rolls away. And the early church understood that. This matters because some people treat Matthew 27 like it's some big overreaction, but it's not. And the early church didn't treat it that way. Ignatius, Irenaeus, Origen, they treated Matthew 27 as part of Christ's victory over death. Now, they didn't all explain the same detail the same way, and later Christian tradition sometimes tells a story with more gravitas than Matthew does. So I agree, we need to be careful. But the broad instinct is clear. Christ dies. The place of death is shaken. The righteous dead are touched by victory. The grave starts losing ground. That's why this text fed later a reflection on what Christians come to call the harrowing of hell. That instinct didn't come from nowhere. It grew out of passages like this one. The church looked at Matthew 27 and they saw a battlefield report. Not the whole report. Not every detail that we want, but enough to know what happened. The death of Jesus didn't merely purchase a future resurrection in the abstract. It started breaking death open right there in the present. And that's why the symbolic reading feels thin to me. The passage has force because Matthew reports it as an event. So what does Matthew want us to see? He wants us to see that the cross isn't some defeat that gets fixed later by the resurrection. He wants us to see that the cross itself is already an assault on death. Look at the verbs. The veil was torn, the earth shook, the rocks were split, the tombs were opened, the saints were raised. God is acting in every line. The city that rejected the Messiah now has vindication walking right there through the streets. The leaders who honored dead prophets are now confronted by dead saints who he has made living again. And the first cracks in death show up before Sunday morning. Matthew's not giving us a zombie movie. He's giving a resurrection claim. These aren't cursed bodies roaming the streets. Matthew calls them saints, holy ones, the faithful dead. The cross didn't simply set up the resurrection. It started it. There was a man by the name of Morrow of Sardis. He's preaching in the 2nd century, and he put it like this: who hung the earth in place is hanged. So just ask yourself, have I made the cross too small? Because Matthew 27 tells us that when Jesus died, death itself took the hit. The veil tears, the earth shakes, the rocks split, the tombs open, the saints rise, and the city sees. If Matthew's right, and he is, then the cross was already working before Sunday morning. I don't think the Easter story has zombies like we see on TV, but I think Matthew's telling us something almost as shocking. When Jesus died, the graveyard felt it. The cross wasn't simply a setup for victory. It was the first strike of victory. Let's not rush past Matthew 27. Stay there, read it again, and ask yourself, what was the cross doing while the world thought it was only watching a death? And if this helped you see the passage more clearly, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments whether you think Matthew meant a literal public event and why. And join me for my next video dropping in a couple of days. What did Jesus do on Saturday? Until next time, God bless you.